In the beginning, there was only a vast emptiness, a boundless expanse, where matter and energy drifted without purpose, moving in gentle, unpredictable currents. The universe had no shape, no rhythm, only a quiet potential that waited patiently to be awakened. And in this void, the first sparks of consciousness stirred, small glimmers of energy destined to become the foundation of life. Arceus, the creator, existed beyond time and space, observing this emptiness with a silent, incomprehensible wisdom. Its awareness stretched across the void, sensing every pulse, every vibration, every possible outcome of the infinite possibilities. The primordial universe was chaotic, yet balanced in its own way, a blank canvas where creation would one day take form. Slowly, under the subtle influence of Arceus, the first threads of structure began to appear. Time, once meaningless, started to flow in gentle waves. Space itself began to stretch and curve, forming pockets where matter could gather and coalesce. The energy of the cosmos condensed into patterns, tiny fluctuations that hinted at future stability. These were the first signs that life, as it would one day be known, was preparing to awaken. Within these pockets of formation, the first creatures, primitive and almost imperceptible, began to emerge. They were not yet Pokémon in the form we would recognize. Rather, they were luminous sparks, small concentrations of energy that experimented with movement, perception, and interaction. They floated through the primordial currents, guided by instinct and subtle cues from the energy surrounding them. Each movement was a learning process, a test of balance, adaptation, and awareness. Arceus's influence was always present, but never intrusive. It allowed the sparks to explore, to experiment, and to fail, knowing that every attempt, every fluctuation, every moment of trial would contribute to the shaping of life. And in this delicate balance, the seeds of the legendary Pokémon began to form. Dialga, the master of time, quietly established cycles and rhythms, teaching the sparks the flow of cause and effect. Palkia, ruler of space, created vast expanses and safe zones, ensuring that the developing creatures had room to explore and grow. Giratina, the embodiment of chaos, introduced unpredictability, small disturbances that challenged the sparks to react, adapt, and develop resilience. The first sparks began to perceive one another. They moved together in patterns that seemed instinctual, yet guided by some invisible understanding. Even without communication as we know it, they learned to sense energy, movement, and intention. They discovered cooperation and subtle forms of interaction, forming the earliest communities of life, fragile and fleeting, yet remarkable in their complexity. In this silence, a sense of wonder filled the primordial void. The sparks, the currents of energy, the flowing time and stretching space, all were part of a greater plan, woven together with care, precision, and an infinite patience that only Arceus could possess. Each spark carried within it the potential for evolution, for growth, for becoming something extraordinary. As the first patterns of life solidified, the first glimmers of awareness appeared. The sparks sensed that they were part of something larger, a network of energy that extended beyond themselves. They learned to respond to subtle shifts in time, space, and chaos, their small actions influencing one another in ways they could not yet comprehend. These interactions were the beginning of a chain that would one day lead to the complex, vibrant world of Pokémon, where every creature, from the tiniest Pichu to the greatest legendary, would have a role to play. Chapter 1 closes with a quiet sense of anticipation and awe. The primordial world, though still formless and fragile, had begun to pulse with life, guided by unseen hands and silent wisdom. Every spark, every current, every moment of adaptation was a step toward a future filled with wonder, adventure, and the infinite potential of life. The story had begun, and with it, the first chapter of a world that would one day be home to legends, mysteries, and Pokémon beyond imagination. As the primordial sparks continued to drift and move, the universe began to take shape around them. Time, once an abstract concept, now flowed like a gentle river, guiding the rhythm of creation. Seconds stretched into cycles, cycles into patterns, and these patterns allowed the first forms of order to emerge. Without this invisible structure, the sparks would have floated endlessly, lost in the vastness of nothingness, never learning, never growing. Dialga, the legendary master of time, radiated subtle pulses that the sparks could feel. These pulses were not commands, but invitations. A chance to explore, to move in sequence, to perceive before acting, and to learn the consequences of every motion. Some sparks responded quickly, following the rhythm with surprising grace. Others faltered, hesitated, or repeated the same movements countless times, slowly understanding the patterns that now governed their world. Meanwhile, space itself began to stretch and fold under the influence of Palkia. The void expanded into regions of density and openness, creating areas where sparks could congregate safely and areas where exploration was risky and thrilling. These spatial variations introduced the first lessons of navigation, choice, and consequence. The sparks learned that some paths offered safety, others offered challenge, and each decision had subtle effects on their surroundings. Giratina, representing controlled chaos, introduced gentle disturbances, fluctuations in energy that shifted currents and altered trajectories. These disturbances were never destructive. Instead, they served as lessons in adaptability. Sparks that could adjust quickly thrived, learning to anticipate changes and respond creatively. Others discovered the beauty of failure, understanding that mistakes were part of growth and essential to the emergence of life as it would one day be known. Within these shifting currents of time, space, and chaos, the first sparks began to interact more intentionally. They discovered the faint energies of one another, subtle shifts in movement, and patterns of repetition. Some began to follow others, not out of instinct, but out of curiosity. Small clusters formed, rudimentary groups that experimented with cooperation. These clusters were fragile and temporary, yet they marked the first steps toward the complex social structures that would define the Pokémon world. Arceus, observing from beyond the flow of time and space, allowed these interactions to unfold freely. There was no rush, no interference, only a patient awareness that guided the environment in imperceptible ways. Every ripple of energy, every movement of a spark, was a note in a symphony of creation. Even failure and disarray were carefully balanced, teaching the sparks resilience and creativity. As the first day cycles passed, cycles measured not by sun or moon, but by the invisible pulse of time itself, the sparks grew more attuned to the world. They began to anticipate patterns, to explore space with intent, and to interact with each other in increasingly complex ways. Some even began to mimic the subtle influences of Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina, practicing coordination and timing as if they could sense the hand of the legends guiding them. By the close of Chapter 2, the primordial world had moved beyond mere potential. It now possessed structure, rhythm, and the beginnings of life as we understand it. Time had a pattern, space had depth, and chaos had purpose. The sparks, though still simple, had begun to learn, adapt, and prepare for the transformations that would eventually make them Pokémon. The universe was awakening, quietly, deliberately, with an elegance that only eternity could produce. Each pulse of energy, each subtle shift, and each interaction of the sparks was a step closer to the creation of a world where life, evolution, and legend would coexist in harmony. And so, the story continued, with the first rhythms of life echoing across the newly formed cosmos, hinting at the marvels yet to come. As the patterns of time and space stabilized, the sparks of energy that floated through the primordial world began to take on a new quality. They were no longer simply passive glimmers. They moved with intention, curiosity, and a faint awareness of one another. Each pulse, each oscillation, each shimmer was an experiment in motion, a subtle dance that echoed the rhythms set by Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina. The influence of Dialga was palpable. Time flowed in gentle undulations, allowing some sparks to move swiftly, tracing long arcs of energy, while others lingered, pausing to sense the currents and evaluate the faint disturbances around them. These fluctuations taught the first lessons of cause and effect. Every movement had a consequence. Every choice shifted the surrounding energy. Some sparks learned quickly, adjusting their paths with precision, while others repeated patterns countless times, gradually refining their coordination and understanding of the environment. Palkia's touch shaped the very spaces in which the sparks moved. Open expanses allowed for exploration, while narrower channels required focus, strategy, and awareness of other sparks. Some areas acted almost like early arenas, where the interactions between sparks created feedback loops of energy, teaching them subtle lessons about proximity, cooperation, and response. Movement became not just an instinctual act, but a form of communication, a silent conversation carried through vibration and timing. Giratina, as ever, introduced unpredictability. Small ripples in energy, sudden shifts in the flow of space, and unexpected disturbances tested the adaptability of the sparks. Those that could navigate these deviations thrived, their movements becoming more intricate, their timing more precise. Others discovered that failure was not destructive, but informative. A stumble, a misstep, a collision, all carried insight, shaping the emerging intelligence of these early forms of life. Within these complex currents, the first interactions between sparks began to resemble social behavior. Some sparks began following others, mimicking movements and responding to subtle cues in energy. They discovered the first rudiments of cooperation, forming small clusters that moved in harmony through the vast expanses of the primordial world. These clusters were fragile, yet they were remarkable in their sophistication, hinting at the social structures that would one day define Pokémon communities. Curiosity became a driving force. Sparks that lingered near disturbances introduced by Giratina explored new movements, tested limits, and learned to adjust to changing conditions. Those near others began subtle exchanges, weaving patterns together in ways that were not dictated by instinct but by a growing sense of awareness. The first lessons in observation, strategy, and adaptation were being written into the fabric of their very existence. Arceus, observing from beyond, allowed all of this to unfold naturally. The Creator's presence was felt as a subtle guidance, a gentle framework within which the sparks could experiment freely. There was no rush, no pressure, only the patient unfolding of patterns, movements, and interactions. Each spark, each ripple, each alignment was a note in the symphony of creation, a precursor to the complex orchestration of life yet to come. By the end of this chapter, the first signs of individuality emerged. Some sparks displayed tendencies toward leadership, guiding smaller clusters along certain paths. Others developed a cautious, observational nature, learning through watching and mimicking. And some became naturally playful, testing boundaries, experimenting with motion and energy in ways that were unpredictable yet instructive. Each type of behavior contributed to the overall ecosystem, teaching lessons of adaptation, resilience, and interconnection. The primordial world, once formless and chaotic, had now begun to hum with life. Movements were coordinated, interactions were purposeful, and the subtle influence of the legendaries ensured that every spark was learning, growing, and preparing for the next stage of creation. Evolution was not yet visible in form, but it was taking place invisibly, in energy, in interaction, and in the first whispers of awareness. Chapter 3 closes with a quiet sense of anticipation. The sparks had learned to move, to respond, and to interact, and the universe itself seemed to hold its breath, ready for the next steps. The first glimmers of life, though still simple, were beginning to reflect patterns that would one day become the incredible diversity of Pokémon. The story of creation continued, a careful, patient unfolding, each movement a step toward the world of legends, ecosystems, and extraordinary creatures yet to come. As time flowed steadily under Dialga's subtle influence, and the expanses of space shaped by Palkia became more defined, the primordial sparks of energy began to take on increasingly complex forms. They no longer shimmered as indistinct points. Now shapes emerged, outlines that hinted at the creatures they would become. Some developed soft curves and flowing movements, while others began forming angular, precise edges. Each spark was an experiment in form, guided by the quiet influence of the legendaries and the gentle rhythms of the universe. The world itself seemed to respond to these early formations. Currents of energy, subtle fluctuations of gravity, and invisible waves of matter adjusted around the growing shapes, creating zones of stability and areas of challenge. Sparks that explored freely discovered environments that encouraged growth and adaptation. Those that lingered too long in one place often found themselves nudged by unseen forces, learning to move, to react, and to adjust. The influence of Giratina, unpredictable yet controlled, was essential in this process, ensuring that the emerging life would not stagnate, but would learn resilience and creativity. Social structures began to take shape. The first communities of sparks started to form naturally, clustering in patterns that allowed mutual observation, shared learning, and early cooperation. Some sparks took on leadership roles, guiding others through space with subtle movements and signals. Others became observers, watching and imitating the actions of their peers, refining their understanding of patterns, timing, and coordination. Playfulness and experimentation emerged, introducing lessons that would become foundational behaviors in Pokémon interactions. Collaboration, empathy, and adaptive problem-solving. Within these early communities, subtle communication began to arise. Sparks would align their movements in response to the presence or actions of another, creating intricate patterns that spoke volumes without words. This silent exchange of energy laid the groundwork for more advanced interaction in the future. It was here, in these gentle harmonies and collisions, that the first rudimentary social bonds formed. These bonds were fragile, yet they hinted at the complex interdependencies that would define ecosystems in the Pokémon world. The legendaries continued to guide without imposing. Dialga's control of time introduced regularity, teaching the spark cycles of activity and rest. Palkia's spatial influence created safe zones for exploration and growth while still allowing challenges to arise naturally. Giratina's chaotic energy ensured that the creatures remained adaptable, able to respond to surprises and disturbances with ingenuity. And Arceus, ever present and silent, ensured that these forces remained balanced, allowing life to flourish organically, without interference, yet with purpose. Movement and form were now inseparable. Sparks learned to navigate through currents, adapt to energy fluctuations, and respond to each other with precision. Some practiced mimicry, replicating the movements of others with increasing accuracy. Others discovered unique motions of their own, testing the boundaries of their forms and abilities. These early experiments were invisible yet crucial, laying the foundation for the evolution of abilities, skills, and behaviors that would define Pokémon for eons. As these early communities matured, patterns of hierarchy and interdependence naturally emerged. Some sparks displayed natural leadership, organizing groups for movement or exploration. Others contributed through observation, coordination, or protection. And still others found joy in exploration and experimentation, pushing limits and introducing novelty into the system. Every interaction strengthened the structure of these communities, creating a complex network of relationships that was both flexible and resilient. By the end of Chapter 4, the primordial world was no longer simply a stage for life. It had become a living, breathing system, rich with energy, movement, and interaction. Sparks had begun to assume recognizable forms. Early communities had established patterns of cooperation and leadership, and the legendary's subtle guidance ensured balance and adaptability at every turn. The universe, once silent and empty, now hummed with life, energy, and possibility. The first true signs of the Pokémon world were taking shape, a tapestry of form, movement, and social complexity, quietly orchestrated by the unseen hands of Arceus and the legendaries. The story continued, each pulse of energy, each interaction, and each ripple of influence building toward a world that would one day be filled with extraordinary creatures, legends, and boundless wonder. The world of emerging Pokémon had grown increasingly complex. The sparks, now taking more defined shapes, explored their surroundings with a growing sense of awareness. No longer simple points of energy, they had become small forms, capable of movement, reaction, and subtle interaction. Each step they took, each gesture, was an experiment, a delicate testing of what their forms and abilities could achieve. Dialga's influence continued to shape perception and timing. The flow of time taught the creatures patterns, enabling them to anticipate the consequences of their actions. A spark that moved with precision learned not only the rhythm of its environment, but also the effects its motion had on nearby companions. Some began to adjust instinctively, synchronizing movements in small groups, creating the earliest forms of coordinated behavior. These were the first lessons in strategy, in thinking beyond immediate action, in planning for outcomes. Palkia's spatial influence encouraged exploration and experimentation. Certain areas of the primordial world became training grounds where the sparks tested speed, coordination, and spatial awareness. Those that could navigate these spaces efficiently gained confidence and began to experiment with new maneuvers. The first sparks to successfully adapt their movements in response to the subtle currents of Palkia's space became leaders, naturally guiding others in movement, observation, and exploration. Giratina's chaotic energy introduced unpredictable variables. Shifts in currents, sudden distortions of space, and unexpected obstacles created situations that demanded problem-solving and adaptability. Sparks that could respond creatively learned to manipulate their environment subtly, using instinct and emerging intelligence to thrive. These trials were invisible but essential, shaping both physical abilities and cognitive potential, laying the groundwork for the rich diversity of skills Pokémon would later display. The legendaries began to exert more noticeable influence on these early forms of life. Occasionally, Dialga would manifest a fleeting shimmer, a pulse that resonated through space and time, teaching sparks the subtle flow of rhythm and anticipation. Palkia would stretch or fold space, creating temporary paths that encouraged exploration or guided movement. Giratina's unpredictable presence forced sparks to adapt quickly, fostering innovation and problem-solving. Though invisible most of the time, the sparks could sense these energies, and their movements reflected an innate understanding of guidance without explicit instruction. Within the small communities, sparks began experimenting with cooperation and strategy. Some took on the role of scouts, venturing ahead to explore new territories and alert others of changes or disturbances. Others acted as observers, analyzing patterns and mimicking movements with increasing precision. Playfulness became a form of learning, as sparks tested limits, discovered cause and effect, and refined their coordination. These early exercises were the foundation for the complex skills and abilities that would one day define Pokémon battles, teamwork, and interaction. Interestingly, individuality began to emerge more clearly. Some sparks were naturally curious, exploring with boldness and creativity. Others were cautious, observing before acting, refining strategy through patience and attention. Still others displayed remarkable adaptability, responding to chaotic shifts with ingenuity. These traits were not yet permanent, but the repeated interactions, experiments, and exposures to the energies of the legendaries reinforced these tendencies, forming the first hints of personality and preference. Arceus watched quietly, allowing the sparks freedom to explore, fail, succeed, and innovate. Every pulse of energy, every subtle adjustment, every response to the invisible guidance of Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina was part of a larger orchestration. Creation was not imposed, it was cultivated, nurtured through interaction, challenge, and subtle influence. By the end of Chapter 5, the primordial world was alive with movement, strategy, and learning. Sparks had acquired early skills, communities were forming cooperative behaviors, and the influence of the legendaries provided guidance and challenges that would shape future generations. The first signs of intelligence, strategy, and adaptability were emerging, hinting at the rich, complex world of Pokémon yet to come. The universe, once formless and chaotic, now thrummed with organized energy. Each spark, each movement, and each interaction carried the promise of evolution, skill, and legendary guidance. The story of creation continued, a patient unfolding of life, learning, and the infinite possibilities of the Pokémon world. As the primordial world settled into a rhythm of time, space, and energy, the sparks of life that had taken form began to interact with one another in increasingly intricate ways. Movements that were once random now carried intention, and responses that were once instinctual began to reflect subtle awareness. The world was no longer merely a stage. It was a living, dynamic system where each action created ripples felt across the community. Dialga's pulses continued to shape perception of time. Sparks could anticipate the flow of events, sensing when others would act and adjusting accordingly. Small groups learned to move in synchrony, exploring areas together while maintaining distance and spacing that allowed for optimal navigation. Timing became a silent language, a rhythm understood without thought, teaching sparks how to cooperate while maintaining individuality. Palkia's influence shaped the dimensions of interaction. Expansive spaces encouraged exploration and independent movement, while narrower zones forced cooperation, awareness, and strategic alignment. Sparks learned to navigate each environment, not just physically, but socially, recognizing patterns in the behavior of their companions and responding to signals of movement, energy, and subtle changes in space. This was the beginning of social intelligence, the foundation of trust, and early hierarchies within the Spark communities. Giratina introduced chaos deliberately, creating small anomalies in currents and space. These disruptions challenged the Sparks to adapt quickly, teaching the first lessons of resilience and problem-solving. Sparks that could adjust became leaders, guiding others through uncertainty. Those that hesitated learned from observation, refining their understanding of consequence and reaction. Every disruption reinforced the importance of flexibility, creativity, and awareness, laying the groundwork for the adaptability that would define future Pokémon behavior. Legendaries' presence became more evident, though still subtle. Occasional flashes of energy from Dialga aligned groups with time's rhythm. Spatial distortions from Palkia revealed hidden paths, creating opportunities for exploration and experimentation. Giratina's chaotic waves tested the limits of adaptation, encouraging Sparks to innovate. Through these invisible lessons, the emerging creatures began to recognize patterns, anticipate events, and respond with both instinct and strategy. These were the earliest forms of mentorship. Guidance provided not through speech or force, but through the shaping of the environment itself. Interactions among Sparks became increasingly complex. Early forms of cooperation emerged, with some Sparks assisting others in movement or exploration. Curiosity drove experimentation, and playfulness became an essential tool for learning. Sparks discovered that working together allowed for greater efficiency, safety, and discovery. Conflicts arose, not from aggression, but from competition for optimal paths or energy. And these encounters refined strategy, teaching the Sparks to assess risks, evaluate options, and make decisions with foresight. Personality began to surface. Certain Sparks displayed boldness and curiosity, venturing into new areas and testing boundaries. Others were cautious, carefully observing before acting. Some became natural coordinators, guiding groups through complex environments. This emerging individuality was critical. It allowed communities to adapt, diversify, and thrive. Sparks learned not only how to survive, but how to excel, each developing strengths and strategies that complemented those of their companions. Arceus continued to watch over the world with silent patience. Every pulse of energy, every adjustment in rhythm, and every subtle influence of the legendaries contributed to a delicate balance. Creation was not forced, it was nurtured. The Sparks, learning from one another, and from the unseen guidance of the legendaries, were becoming capable of the first true signs of strategy, social organization, and adaptive intelligence. By the end of Chapter 6, the primordial world had matured into a dynamic ecosystem. Movements were coordinated, cooperation was beginning to flourish, and individual personalities were emerging. The invisible influence of the legendaries ensured that the environment continued to challenge, teach, and guide, preparing the Sparks for the transformations that would eventually make them fully fledged Pokémon. The universe, once silent and simple, now vibrated with interaction, learning, and the guiding hand of Arceus and the legendaries. Each spark, each ripple, and each moment of adaptation carried within it the promise of evolution, skill, and intelligence. The story of creation moved forward, an intricate dance of energy and potential, shaping the incredible world of Pokémon that was slowly taking form. The primordial world had grown richer with life, movement, and interaction. The sparks, now more defined in form, had begun to discover not only how to move and cooperate, but also the first signs of unique abilities. Subtle manifestations of energy flowed through some sparks, guiding them towards special movements, glowing trails, or bursts of force. These were the early indicators of what would one day become the extraordinary powers Pokémon wield, and they were forming naturally as the sparks learned to interact with their environment and with one another. Dialga's influence in the flow of time allowed some sparks to anticipate patterns with increasing precision. These sparks began demonstrating early skills of prediction, timing, and synchronization, learning to move in perfect harmony with groups or to avoid hazards before they appeared. Palkia's spatial guidance encouraged exploration, and certain sparks discovered they could manipulate minor distortions of space, enhancing movement, coordination, or reach. Giratina's chaotic energy introduced unpredictability, challenging sparks to respond with agility and creativity, sharpening their emerging abilities. Among the sparks, subtle bonds were forming with the legendaries themselves. While most interactions remained imperceptible, some sparks began to sense guidance, an invisible hand influencing choices, movement, and energy. Dialga's pulse occasionally aligned with a spark's rhythm, creating a connection that reinforced timing and anticipation. Palkia's dimensional influence subtly favored sparks that explored with curiosity, guiding them toward discovery. Giratina's chaos tested adaptability, rewarding sparks that responded with ingenuity and courage. These invisible bonds laid the foundation for future legendaries' relationships with the Pokémon world, where guidance, mentorship, and legacy would intertwine. Interactions between sparks grew increasingly sophisticated. Some sparks demonstrated instinctive leadership, guiding others through complex paths, teaching coordination without deliberate intention. Others became teachers or protectors, subtly influencing companions to move more efficiently, avoid hazards, or explore safely. Play became a tool for learning as sparks tested limits, refined movements, and discovered the consequences of their actions. Each interaction, each experiment, contributed to a growing web of understanding and skill. Individuality became more pronounced. Some sparks exhibited daring curiosity, exploring unstable currents, learning to manipulate their abilities to adapt. Others displayed caution, choosing observation over action, and gradually mastering precision and control. A few sparks showed an innate aptitude for manipulation of energy, responding intuitively to spatial shifts or temporal flows. These variations in traits and tendencies created a diverse and resilient community, capable of thriving in a complex, dynamic environment. The legendaries continued to influence from the background. Their guidance was never overt, but always present. Dialga's control of time taught the importance of patience, rhythm, and foresight. Palkia's shaping of space rewarded exploration, curiosity, and clever navigation. Giratina's subtle chaos encouraged adaptability, creativity, and resilience. And Arceus, observing all, ensured that each spark, each interaction, and each development contributed harmoniously to the unfolding ecosystem. By the end of Chapter 7, the first true signs of abilities had emerged. Sparks were no longer simply forms of energy. They were learning, experimenting, and discovering powers unique to themselves. Communities had evolved into dynamic networks of cooperation, observation, and guidance, and the invisible bonds between the legendaries and the emerging sparks hinted at a future where mentorship, legacy, and guidance would shape the Pokémon world in ways both seen and unseen. The primordial world now pulsed with promise. Every movement, every interaction, and every spark of energy carried the seeds of extraordinary abilities. The story of creation continued, an intricate tapestry of life, skill, and legendary influence, preparing the world for the evolution, exploration, and wonders that would one day define the Pokémon universe. As the primordial world continued to evolve, the sparks of life began to inhabit increasingly defined spaces. Open plains, flowing rivers of energy, clusters of dense currents, and pockets of turbulence became the stage for experimentation, exploration, and adaptation. Each spark, now more defined in form and ability, discovered its place within this dynamic environment. Some gravitated toward the energy-rich areas, learning to draw power from subtle currents, while others adapted to the more chaotic regions, mastering resilience and improvisation. With these emerging environments, early ecosystems began to form. Sparks moved in patterns that resembled natural cycles, some exploring freely while others followed, forming delicate balances of interaction. Certain sparks discovered the benefits of cooperation, combining abilities to navigate complex spaces or to stabilize unstable currents. Others relied on instinct and observation, learning from the successes and failures of their companions. These interactions, subtle yet profound, created the first webs of interdependence, laying the groundwork for the complex food chains, habitats, and relationships that would define the Pokémon world. The legendaries' influence was ever present. Dialga's pulses reinforced temporal cycles, allowing ecosystems to establish rhythms of activity, rest, and renewal. Sparks began to respond to these rhythms intuitively, adjusting movement and energy in harmony with the flow of time. Palkia's shaping of space created areas of shelter, exploration, and opportunity, guiding sparks to discover zones that encouraged growth, experimentation, and interaction. Giratina's controlled chaos introduced disturbances, teaching sparks to adapt, improvise, and thrive in the face of unpredictability. These subtle influences created balance, encouraging diversity, adaptability, and resilience. Within these early ecosystems, sparks began to specialize. Some naturally explored and mapped the flowing currents, becoming guides for others. Some developed precise movements, stabilizing groups and smoothing interactions. Others discovered unique abilities, manipulating their environment or energy in ways that complemented the community. These emerging roles reinforced cooperation, strategy, and mutual learning, reflecting the delicate harmony that would characterize future Pokémon habitats. Social bonds grew stronger as well. Clusters of sparks began to synchronize movements, exchanging energy and signals in silent, instinctive communication. Play and experimentation became vital tools for learning, allowing sparks to refine abilities, explore limits, and test strategies. Occasional conflicts arose, but these were constructive rather than destructive. Teaching, negotiation, adaptation, and problem-solving. The first rudimentary hierarchies began to appear, not through dominance, but through skill, adaptability, and the ability to guide and protect others. Legendaries were no longer invisible guides alone. Their presence began to resonate more tangibly with certain sparks, especially those that demonstrated curiosity, creativity, or resilience. Dialga's temporal influence reinforced the importance of timing and rhythm. Palkia's spatial shaping rewarded exploration and clever navigation. Giratina's chaotic energy tested adaptability and innovation. These sparks, responsive to the subtle lessons of the legendaries, would one day become the foundation of unique lineages and powerful Pokémon, linked to the eternal guidance of their legendary mentors. Arceus remained the ultimate overseer, ensuring that all forces, order, chaos, time, and space, worked in harmony. Every interaction, every adaptation, and every discovery contributed to a grand design that was both flexible and resilient. The balance of the primordial world was delicate but deliberate, creating an environment where life could grow, specialize, and flourish. By the end of Chapter 8, ecosystems had fully begun to emerge. Currents, territories, clusters, and movement patterns formed intricate webs of interaction. The sparks had become more than mere forms of energy. They were evolving entities, capable of learning, cooperation, and strategic adaptation. The subtle influence of the legendaries had guided these communities toward balance, ensuring that life would continue to diversify and adapt in harmony with the universe. The primordial world now pulsed with coordinated energy and dynamic relationships. Every spark, every movement, and every interaction was part of a larger, harmonious design, creation had moved beyond individual sparks into a networked system, preparing the stage for the extraordinary diversity, intelligence, and power of the Pokémon universe that would soon unfold. The primordial world had grown into a vibrant, interconnected system. Each spark of life had discovered its place within the emerging ecosystems, and clusters of sparks moved with greater coordination, forming intricate networks of interaction. Currents of energy flowed through the environment, shaping the paths of sparks and guiding their movements in ways that were both subtle and profound. Life had moved beyond mere survival. It had begun to experiment, adapt, and thrive in a complex, dynamic web of relationships. Dialga's influence of time provided rhythm to the ecosystem. Sparks learned the patterns of activity, the cycles of movement, and the consequences of action. Some began to anticipate the actions of others, synchronizing movements in harmony with the temporal flow. Palkia's spatial shaping defined territories, safe zones, and areas of exploration. Sparks adjusted to these spaces with increasing intelligence, navigating obstacles, currents, and boundaries with this remarkable adaptability. Giratina's chaotic influence ensured that no spark or cluster became stagnant, introducing random disturbances that required immediate response and creative problem-solving. Within these systems, early forms of specialization emerged. Certain sparks became scouts, venturing into new zones and discovering resources, energy currents, or advantageous positions. Others developed stabilizing behaviors, guiding companions through complex paths, ensuring safe passage, and teaching synchronization. Some sparks discovered unique abilities, manipulating energy in ways that enhanced both movement and cooperation. These early adaptations created diversity within communities, allowing multiple strategies to coexist, strengthen, and evolve over time. Interactions between ecosystems became increasingly complex. Sparks from different clusters began to meet, testing cooperation, curiosity, and adaptability. Some collaborations were temporary, small alliances for shared exploration or resource use. Others evolved into longer-term cooperative networks, where sparks learned to rely on one another, responding to subtle signals of need, warning, or opportunity. Play and experimentation became crucial to these interactions, as sparks tested each other's abilities, explored limitations, and refined collective strategies. The legendaries' guidance became more tangible. Dialga's temporal pulses helped coordinate larger networks, synchronizing clusters and reinforcing lessons in timing and anticipation. Palkia's manipulation of space revealed new opportunities, hidden paths, and resources that encouraged sparks to explore beyond immediate surroundings. Giratina's controlled chaos introduced unpredictability, ensuring that creativity, adaptability, and strategic thinking remained essential for survival and growth. Arceus, as always, maintained the overarching balance, allowing the sparks and their ecosystems to thrive within a framework of order, chaos, and infinite potential. Personality and identity became increasingly distinct. Sparks developed tendencies toward leadership, exploration, protection, or observation. Each cluster developed its own culture of movement, cooperation, and adaptation. Some sparks emerged as early exemplars of strength or skill, influencing the behavior and development of others. These dynamics, though subtle, established patterns that would echo through future generations of Pokémon, guiding instincts, affinities, and social structures. By the end of Chapter 9, the primordial world had transformed into a network of thriving ecosystems. Life was not merely existing, it was experimenting, learning, cooperating, and adapting in ways that hinted at the intelligence and strategy of future Pokémon. The legendaries' influence had guided growth, skill, and adaptation, creating a harmonious balance between order, chaos, and natural evolution. The universe now pulsed with the intricate dance of life. Each spark, each interaction, and each adaptation contributed to a growing, interconnected system, preparing the stage for the extraordinary diversity, intelligence, and legendary presence that would define the Pokémon world for eons to come. As the primordial world matured, The sparks of life began to take on shapes increasingly familiar to what we now recognize as Pokémon. Their forms became distinct, with bodies, appendages, and features emerging from the fluid energy that had once been formless. Some shapes suggested flight, others strength, and others flexibility. These early Pokémon were far from fully evolved, but their identities were beginning to crystallize, shaped by the rhythms of time, space, and chaos that governed the universe. Dialga's pulses continued to provide the framework of time. Early Pokémon learned to anticipate patterns, coordinate actions, and move with precision. Groups began to synchronize their movements, practicing behaviors that hinted at hunting, evasion, and coordinated play. Palkia's manipulation of space-defined territories, creating safe zones and areas that demanded skillful navigation. Pokémon discovered the advantages of exploring these spaces carefully, testing abilities, and observing how energy flowed within the environment. Giratina's controlled chaos introduced irregular challenges, forcing adaptation, creativity, and responsiveness to unpredictable events. Within these emerging ecosystems, the legendaries' guidance became almost tangible. Dialga's influence reinforced cycles of rest, activity, and learning, embedding a sense of rhythm into early behaviors. Palkia's shaping of space rewarded curiosity, clever navigation, and exploration of new territories. Giratina's chaotic energy tested resilience, problem-solving, and adaptability. Arceus remained the overarching presence, ensuring balance across all forces. These invisible connections between Pokémon and legendaries established a subtle mentorship, a foundational relationship that would resonate through generations. Interactions among early Pokémon grew in complexity. Some began to cooperate in exploration, sharing knowledge of terrain, energy currents, and safe paths. Others engaged in playful competitions, testing strength, speed, and agility. These activities were critical for learning, reinforcing both individual skill and group strategy. Sparks that developed specialized abilities began to assume roles within their communities, whether as protectors, scouts, guides, or innovators. Play, observation, and adaptation became the first tools of social and cognitive development, shaping behaviors that would define Pokémon instincts. Personality and identity flourished. Some Pokémon displayed boldness, venturing into chaotic currents or exploring new regions. Others were cautious, observing before acting and refining skills over time. A few demonstrated exceptional aptitude, manipulating energy, space, or timing in ways that suggested intelligence beyond instinct. These traits created diversity within communities, ensuring resilience and adaptability. Each Pokémon became a unique participant in the intricate web of interactions, each contributing to the stability and evolution of the primordial ecosystem. The ecosystems themselves grew more structured. Clusters of Pokémon interacted dynamically, with movement patterns, hierarchies, and cooperative behaviors emerging naturally. These interactions were subtle yet profound, creating a network of relationships that reinforced the development of skills, social intelligence, and survival strategies. Pokémon learned from each other, adapting techniques, refining abilities, and discovering the first rudimentary forms of instinctive strategy that would become crucial for survival and evolution. By the end of Chapter 10, the first recognizable Pokémon had fully emerged. Communities thrived in complex ecosystems. Skills and abilities were developing, and the subtle guidance of the legendaries had established a foundation of rhythm, balance, and mentorship. The primordial world, once chaotic and formless, now pulsed with life, intelligence, and interaction, preparing the stage for evolution, diversity, and the extraordinary wonders of the Pokémon universe. Creation had progressed beyond energy, form, and simple interaction. The universe now contained living, learning entities, guided by unseen forces, exploring, adapting, and preparing to inhabit a world that would be shaped by legend, skill, and the intricate relationships between life and the cosmic balance. The primordial world had grown richer, more dynamic, and increasingly intricate. The first recognizable Pokémon moved with purpose, learned from experience, and interacted in ways that hinted at the complex behaviors yet to come. From simple forms, certain sparks began to develop traits that suggested specialization, skill, and the earliest forms of evolution. These were no longer mere shapes in energy. They were the seeds of lineages, carrying within them potential for growth, adaptation, and diversity. Dialga's steady pulse reinforced the rhythm of life, guiding Pokémon to learn timing, coordination, and anticipation. Movements became more refined, and even small gestures carried intent and precision. Some Pokémon discovered the advantages of early teamwork, coordinating actions to navigate energy currents or overcome challenges. These interactions reinforced not only skill but also social cohesion, forming bonds that were both functional and instinctive. Palkia's shaping of space allowed Pokémon to explore and experiment with boundaries, revealing their strengths, weaknesses, and emerging abilities. Early adaptations became evident. Bursts of speed, precision in movement, subtle manipulation of energy flows. Pokémon began to experiment naturally with their own capabilities, testing limits, and discovering how their forms could interact with the world around them. The first sparks of strategy were emerging as creatures learned to leverage environment and energy to their advantage. Giratina's influence continued to introduce unpredictability. Sudden fluctuations and distortions forced Pokémon to innovate, develop creative responses, and refine their abilities. Those that adapted quickly gained not only survival advantages, but also a sense of identity and skill. Chaos, though challenging, encouraged diversity, an essential precursor to evolution. Each disruption taught lessons that would be encoded into instinct, shaping the behaviors and abilities of future generations. Interactions among Pokémon became increasingly sophisticated. Some began forming small, stable communities where roles were naturally distributed. Scouts ventured into new areas. Leaders coordinated group movement, and innovators experimented with abilities. Play and experimentation remained vital as Pokémon tested skills, learned from one another, and refined coordination. Conflicts arose but were resolved through instinctive strategies rather than destructive force, teaching negotiation, timing, and adaptability. The influence of the legendaries became more profound and personalized. Dialga's temporal pulses reinforced learning and rhythm, helping Pokémon coordinate and anticipate outcomes. Palkia's spatial manipulations rewarded exploration and ingenuity, encouraging creatures to discover new paths and expand territories. Giratina's chaos ensured adaptability, resilience, and innovation. Arceus, ever present, maintained overarching balance, allowing these early evolutions and abilities to develop harmoniously within the ecosystem. Individuality flourished. Pokémon displayed emerging personalities, curiosity, caution, boldness, creativity, and leadership. Some Pokémon instinctively guided others, some innovated new forms of movement, and others excelled at observation and coordination. These traits became the foundation for lineages, behaviors, and the diversity that would characterize future generations. Each Pokémon, while part of a community, carried a unique spark of potential, shaped by interaction, environment, and the invisible guidance of the legendaries. By the end of Chapter 11, the first true signs of evolutionary lineages had emerged. Skills were refined, abilities became more distinct, and the subtle mentorship of the legendaries had guided these Pokémon toward adaptability, specialization, and interdependence. The primordial world, once chaotic and simple, now teemed with life capable of learning, growth, and preparation for the complex evolutionary paths that would define the Pokémon universe. The universe now resonated with potential. Each interaction, each adaptation, and each moment of skill contributed to the unfolding story of creation, ensuring that Pokémon would evolve, diversify, and thrive under the watchful influence of Arceus and the guiding legendaries. As the primordial world continued to evolve, the first recognizable Pokémon had grown stronger, more skilled, and increasingly diverse. With these developments, the simple communities of sparks began to intertwine, forming complex ecosystems where different lineages interacted, competed, and cooperated. Life was no longer a collection of isolated sparks. It had become a network of energy, movement, and adaptation, where every interaction contributed to the balance and dynamism of the world. Dialga's temporal influence continued to provide rhythm and order, shaping cycles of activity, rest, and learning across the ecosystems. Pokémon began to anticipate not only their own actions, but also the movements of others, forming coordinated groups and strategic interactions. Patterns emerged within each community, teaching timing, cooperation, and foresight. Palkia's spatial shaping defined territories, safe zones, and energy-rich areas, encouraging exploration, specialization, subtle competition for resources. Pokémon learned to navigate these spaces skillfully, discovering which abilities and movements were most effective in each environment. Giratina's chaotic energy introduced unpredictability at every level. Currents shifted unexpectedly, energy zones fluctuated, and random disturbances challenged the emerging ecosystems. These disruptions were crucial, as they forced Pokémon to innovate, adapt, and refine their abilities continually. The interplay between order and chaos created resilience, diversity, and complexity, ensuring that no lineage remained stagnant. Every adaptation strengthened the web of life, allowing for dynamic balance among multiple forms, skills, and strategies. Interactions between lineages became increasingly sophisticated. Some Pokémon formed temporary alliances, coordinating movement, or sharing access to energy flows. Others engaged in playful competition, testing abilities, and learning from each encounter. These interactions reinforced instincts, honed skills, and strengthened social intelligence. Cooperation and competition became complementary forces, driving adaptation and fostering the emergence of unique abilities and behaviors within each lineage. Early ecosystems developed specialization within lineages. Certain Pokémon became scouts, mapping energy currents, territories, and hazards. Others emerged as protectors, guiding their community through unstable zones or defending clusters against environmental fluctuations. Innovators experimented with abilities, discovering new forms of movement, energy manipulation, and interaction. These roles, though subtle, reinforced the interdependence of Pokémon within each ecosystem and promoted a balanced, adaptive system. The legendaries' guidance became more integrated with the ecosystems. Dialga's temporal influence synchronized entire communities, enhancing coordination, rhythm, and shared understanding. Palkia's shaping of space rewarded exploration and ingenuity, encouraging Pokémon to discover novel paths, opportunities, and territories. Giratina's chaotic energy challenged all forms of life, fostering creativity, resilience, and problem-solving. Arceus maintained overarching balance, ensuring that the ecosystems remain diverse, adaptable, and capable of sustaining life across generations. Individuality and specialization flourished. Pokémon developed distinct behaviors, aptitudes, and tendencies. Some excelled at coordination and leadership, others at exploration or creative problem-solving, and still others at observation and adaptation. These differences reinforced diversity within ecosystems, ensuring that every lineage had a role, contribution, and purpose. The interplay between personal strengths and communal needs created a dynamic, ever-changing balance that echoed the guiding influence of the legendaries. By the end of Chapter 12, the first truly complex ecosystems had emerged, communities. Of Pokémon thrived in dynamic, interconnected networks, where cooperation, competition, and adaptability shaped the survival and evolution of each lineage. The legendaries' influence had become deeply entwined with these ecosystems, guiding development, balance, and the refinement of abilities. The primordial world, once chaotic and simple, now pulsed with intelligent, adaptive life, preparing for the extraordinary diversity, evolution, and legends that would define the Pokémon universe. The universe now shimmered with interwoven energy, skill, and life. Each interaction, each adaptation, and each challenge contributed to a growing tapestry of ecosystems, abilities, and emergent intelligence. Creation had advanced beyond simple life. It had become a network of thriving, evolving communities, guided by Arceus and the subtle, enduring presence of the legendaries. As time flowed steadily, the primordial world grew increasingly intricate. The ecosystems, now rich with diverse Pokémon, began to witness the emergence of advanced evolutionary forms. Early Pokémon had mastered the basic movements, skills, and cooperative behaviors necessary for survival, and now some were beginning to develop traits that hinted at the complexity of future evolutionary branches. These developments were subtle yet profound, representing the first true divergences in lineage, where adaptation met innate potential. Dialga's influence over time ensured that these evolutionary advancements occurred in rhythm with the cycles of the world. Pokémon began to refine strategies, anticipate environmental changes, and adjust behaviors not just for survival, but for mastery of their surroundings. Palkia's spatial guidance shaped territories, encouraging specialization and exploration. Pokémon discovered areas uniquely suited to their emerging abilities, which accelerated adaptation and allowed some to excel beyond their peers. Giratina's chaotic energy continued to challenge these forms, introducing unpredictability that honed resilience, creativity, and instinctive intelligence. Within these evolving ecosystems, early forms of specialization deepened. Scouts, protectors, and innovators refined their roles, developing complex interactions and subtle strategies. Play and experimentation became more sophisticated, allowing Pokémon to test limits, discover unique applications of their abilities, and learn from the consequences of their actions. Communities began to exhibit primitive hierarchies based on skill, intelligence, and adaptability rather than dominance, creating a balance that encouraged growth and cooperation among lineages. The legendaries' influence became more pronounced. Dialga's temporal pulses guided the refinement of complex abilities, teaching Pokémon to anticipate sequences and coordinate with precision. Palkia's manipulation of space encouraged exploration, rewarding innovation, clever use of the environment, and mastery of movement. Giratina's controlled chaos forced adaptation, rewarding creativity, resilience, and problem-solving. These subtle influences began to create the first bonds between legendaries and specific lineages, seeding the legacy of mentorship and guidance that would define future Pokémon legends. Individuality among Pokémon flourished alongside evolutionary potential. Certain lineages developed traits that set them apart: speed, strength, precision, creativity, or intelligence. Within these lineages, Pokémon demonstrated remarkable adaptability, learning to combine instinct with strategy. Communities thrived on diversity, each individual contributing unique abilities and behaviors to maintain the balance of the ecosystem. The early sparks of personality now influenced evolution itself, shaping the abilities, tendencies, and interactions of future generations. Interactions between lineages grew increasingly intricate. Pokémon collaborated across ecosystems, forming alliances to navigate challenging environments or share resources. Competition also emerged as a driving force, motivating adaptation, innovation, and skill refinement. These dynamics, subtle yet pervasive, prepared the Pokémon world for the complex social structures, interspecies interactions, and evolutionary strategies that would define the future. By the end of Chapter 13, the first signs of advanced evolution had become evident. Pokémon were no longer simply functional forms of life. They were diverse, specialized, and capable of complex behaviors. The ecosystems thrived in dynamic balance, guided by the legendary's invisible hand, creating resilience, adaptability, and diversity. The primordial world, once simple and chaotic, now harbored life forms ready to evolve into the extraordinary species, powers, and legends that would define the Pokémon universe for eons. The universe now shimmered with potential. Each spark of energy, each interaction, and each adaptation contributed to the growing tapestry of life, skill, and legend. Creation was no longer merely about forming life. It had become a sophisticated system of evolution, guidance, and legacy, orchestrated by Arceus and the enduring influence of the legendaries. The primordial world had reached a level of complexity previously unseen. Pokémon, now evolved into recognizable forms, had mastered fundamental survival skills, social interaction, and early strategies. Communities had grown into thriving ecosystems, each with its own network of behaviors, hierarchies, and adaptive practices. Yet, beyond these ordinary developments, extraordinary abilities began to emerge, powers so unique and potent that they foreshadowed the legends to come. Dialga's influence of time deepened. Pokémon refined their perception of temporal flow, coordinating movements, predicting patterns, and optimizing actions. Some developed abilities to manipulate energy with precise timing, creating phenomena that seemed almost magical. Palkia's control over space-shaped territories that challenged Pokémon to adapt creatively. Unique forms of movement, environmental manipulation, and spatial awareness emerged, allowing Pokémon to navigate intricate ecosystems with extraordinary skill. Giratina's chaotic influence continued to push boundaries, forcing adaptation, resilience, and creative problem-solving that fostered the emergence of abilities far beyond instinct. Within these ecosystems, the legendaries began consolidating their influence in ways that would define the future of Pokémon. Dialga's pulse reinforced the rhythm of life, embedding a deep understanding of time and sequence into the instincts of emerging species. Palkia's spatial manipulation encouraged exploration and mastery of environment, teaching creatures to interact with space in precise and innovative ways. Giratina's chaos challenged every system, creating opportunities for resilience, ingenuity, and unique abilities to surface. These influences were subtle yet profound, planting the seeds of the legendary bonds that would shape generations of Pokémon to come. Extraordinary abilities began to manifest with greater clarity. Some Pokémon learned to harness energy for defensive or offensive purposes, shaping force in ways that resembled elemental manipulation. Others exhibited heightened intelligence, coordination, or communication skills, enabling complex social strategies and cooperative behavior. Certain individuals demonstrated unique traits, precursors to evolution lines that would one day produce powerful species like Mewtwo, Lugia, or Rayquaza. These extraordinary abilities, emerging naturally from interaction, adaptation, and legendary guidance, marked a new stage in the evolution of life on the primordial plane. Interactions between Pokémon became increasingly intricate. Lineages began to specialize, forming communities built around complementary abilities and roles. Play, competition, and cooperation intertwined, creating an ecosystem of learning and refinement. Pokémon now displayed both individuality and interdependence, combining personal strengths with communal goals to navigate challenges, protect resources, and explore the expanding world. These dynamics reflected not only evolution, but the early emergence of culture and social intelligence. The influence of the legendaries became almost tangible. Certain Pokémon developed intuitive bonds with Dialga, Palkia, or Giratina, responding to unseen guidance and demonstrating abilities that surpassed ordinary instincts. Arceus, overseeing all, maintained balance across ecosystems, ensuring that the emergence of extraordinary powers did not destabilize the world. Through these subtle interactions, the first legacies of mentorship, guidance, and inspiration were established, creating a lineage of life shaped by cosmic forces. By the end of Chapter 14, the primordial world had transformed into a realm of incredible diversity and power. Pokémon had mastered survival, developed extraordinary abilities, and formed thriving communities guided by the invisible hands of the legendaries. Ecosystems had reached balance, and the patterns of evolution, strategy, social interaction were firmly established. The stage was set for the final phase of creation, where the Pokémon universe would fully solidify into the dynamic, diverse, and legendary world known today. Creation had matured. Life now pulsed with skill, intelligence, adaptability, and the extraordinary potential of legendary influence. The universe, once chaotic and formless, was on the brink of a new era, a world in which the Pokémon and their legacies would shape reality, ecosystems, and the stories of countless generations. The primordial world, once a chaotic expanse of energy, currents, and raw potential, had finally reached a stage of remarkable harmony. The sparks that had become Pokémon had evolved, adapted, and refined their abilities across countless cycles of time. Ecosystems now thrived with intricate networks of interaction, cooperation, and competition. The first true generations of Pokémon moved, learned, and existed in balance, a testament to the delicate orchestration of Arceus and the legendaries. Dialga's influence of time had embedded rhythm into the universe. Pokémon now moved with precision, anticipating changes in currents, predicting outcomes, and coordinating effortlessly. Temporal awareness allowed them to adapt, learn from mistakes, and refine instincts into skill. Palkia's shaping of space had provided a canvas upon which these Pokémon could explore, discover, and create their own paths. From soaring currents to hidden chambers, every corner of the primordial world became an opportunity for growth and mastery. Giratina's controlled chaos ensured that no system became stagnant, encouraging adaptation, ingenuity, and resilience in the face of unpredictability. Extraordinary abilities, once rare, had now become more widespread. Pokémon learned to manipulate energy, communicate, and coordinate with unprecedented sophistication. Certain species demonstrated early forms of elemental control, defensive strategies, and problem-solving that would evolve into legendary powers. Bonds between Pokémon strengthened, not just within communities, but across lineages, fostering cooperation, mentorship, and collective growth. These interactions established the first true social intelligence among living beings, a crucial foundation for the diversity and complexity of the Pokémon universe. The legendary's influence was now unmistakable. Dialga guided the flow of time, ensuring that evolutionary cycles, learning processes, and interactions progressed in harmony. Palkia's spatial guidance defined territories, resource-rich areas, and opportunities for exploration, creating the environment in which Pokémon could flourish. Giratina's chaotic energy maintained flexibility, innovation, and resilience, preventing stagnation and encouraging adaptation. Arceus, as the ultimate overseer, ensured that balance prevailed across the universe, allowing life, evolution, and extraordinary ability to coexist in perfect synchrony. The first true legends had begun to emerge among Pokémon. Certain lineages, guided by both innate potential and subtle legendary influence, developed unique traits and powers that would define generations to come. These early legends were not only powerful, but also deeply connected to the world itself, capable of shaping ecosystems, guiding evolution, and influencing the balance between order and chaos. The invisible hand of Arceus had nurtured these lineages, creating a foundation for the myths, tales, and legacies that would endure across time. Ecosystems had matured into intricate, interdependent networks. Every Pokémon had a role, a place, and a purpose. Communities operated with fluid cooperation and instinctive strategy, balancing individuality with collective survival. Play, exploration, and experimentation remained crucial, refining abilities, fostering social intelligence, and ensuring adaptability. Life, once simple energy, had become a dynamic, thriving network of intelligence, skill, and diversity. By the end of Chapter 15, the primordial world had fully transitioned into the first era of the Pokémon universe. Creation was complete. Pokémon moved, lived, and evolved with purpose, their abilities refined, their communities thriving, and their relationships with legendaries firmly established. The universe now pulsed with intelligence, adaptability, and potential, a living testament to the guidance of Arceus and the subtle mentorship of Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina. The stage was set for everything that would follow: evolution, discovery, legendary adventures, and the stories of countless generations of Pokémon. The primordial chaos had given way to order, innovation, and life, an intricate, vibrant world where legends lived not just as tales, but as guardians, guides, and inspirations for the entire universe. And thus, the dawn of the Pokémon world was complete, a magnificent creation ready to flourish across time, space, and imagination.